There is a concept in structural engineering, specifically in the restoration of ancient load-bearing masonry, called the integrity of the bond. It's not about the stone itself. You can have the hardest granite, the most impenetrable marble, the most stoic limestone that history has ever quarried. The stone is the showpiece. It's what you see when you look at the cathedral or the fortress. But the stone is not what keeps the building standing. What keeps the building standing is the mortar. That thin, often invisible, gritty mixture of sand, lime, and water that sits between the giants. It is the negotiation between the unmovable objects. And the thing about mortar is that it is designed to be sacrificial. It is designed to take the stress, to expand and contract with the heat and the cold, so that the stone doesn't have to crack. It absorbs the insults of the weather. It absorbs the shifting of the earth. It is the silent, suffering servant of stability. But there is a breaking point. If you chip away at that mortar, if you scrape it out with a rusted knife because you think it's ugly, or because you think it's weak, or because you simply don't understand what it is doing there, the stones don't just settle. They don't just shift comfortably into a new position. They crash. The physics of the arch collapses. The geometry of the dome fails. And gravity, which has been waiting patiently for centuries, finally wins. We live our lives under the assumption that the roof will stay up. We assume that the geopolitical architecture built in 1945 and reinforced in 1989 is made of stone. We talk about ironclads and steel packs. We look at the United States and we see the granite. We look at our massive economy, our aircraft carriers, our cultural ubiquity, and we think we are the building. But we are not the building. We are just the biggest stones. The building is the alliance. The building is the trust. The building is that sacrificial mortar that binds a superpower to a tiny peninsula in the North Sea or a chain of islands in the Pacific. It is the unglamorous, tedious, boring work of diplomatic maintenance that keeps the roof from caving in on our heads. And if you have a caretaker, a landlord, or a leader who decides one day that he is tired of the mortar, that he resents the bond because it requires maintenance, that he hates the dependency because he thinks he should stand alone, he doesn't just damage the wall, he invites the catastrophe, he invites the dust, he invites the moment where the physics of the world stops working in your favor and starts working against you. We have spent 4 years watching a man pick at the mortar with an ice pick, just to see what would happen. Just to see if the experts were lying, just to see if the stones would float by magic. Well, tonight we are done guessing. Tonight the dust is falling from the ceiling. And that brings us to tonight. That brings us to the sudden, deafening crack that just echoed across the Atlantic Ocean. Because sometimes the floorboards don't just creak. Sometimes they give way entirely. We have grown used to the noise. We have grown callous to the insults, the erratic tweets, the diplomatic breaches that would have ended presidencies in any other era. We have normalized the abnormal so thoroughly that we have lost the ability to be shocked. But we cannot lose the ability to be terrified. Breaking news tonight out of Copenhagen, out of Brussels, and quite frankly, out of a panic-stricken Pentagon. Donald Trump has pushed too far. After weeks of simmering tension, of bizarre demands regarding the purchase of sovereign territory, of veiled threats regarding trade tariffs on our closest European allies, the administration has reportedly issued an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Denmark that is so breathless in its arrogance, so illiterate in its understanding of international law, that it has done the impossible. It has broken the patience of the Vikings. Denmark is flipping out, and I don't use that phrase lightly. The Danish Foreign Ministry, usually the model of Scandinavian reserve, usually the picture of stoic, polite diplomacy, has effectively told the President of the United States to stand down or face the collapse of the northern flank of NATO. This isn't a trade dispute. This isn't a disagreement over cheese tariffs. This is about the Arctic. This is about Greenland. This is about the radar stations that allow us to see a nuclear missile launching from the other side of the world. Trump has reportedly threatened to withdraw U.S. protection, to essentially nullify Article 5, if Denmark does not accede to what is being described by diplomats as a gangster-style shakedown for territorial rights. And the Danes? They didn't blink. They didn't fold. They didn't send a politely worded letter of concern. They signaled that if the U.S. wants to treat the alliance like a protection racket, then the lease is up. The landlord is evicting the tenant. And the tenant in this case is the United States military's ability to see in the dark. To understand why this is a catastrophe and not just a diplomatic spat, you have to understand that this didn't start with a tweet this morning. This is the culmination of an ignorance of history that is so profound it borders on malpractice. We have to go back, not just to 2016, but to 1917, and then to 1941, and then to the darkest, coldest days of the Cold War. The relationship between the United States and Denmark is not a casual friendship. It is not a relationship of convenience. It is a blood pact forged in the necessity of survival. In 1917, the United States purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark. We bought them because we were terrified of German submarines in the Caribbean. We paid in gold. It was a transaction. But it established a precedent that the U.S. views Danish territory as strategic real estate. Fast forward to April 9, 1941, 1 year after Nazi Germany occupied Denmark. The Danish ambassador in Washington, a man named Henrik Kaufmann, did something extraordinary. He defied his own government in Copenhagen, which was under the boot of the Nazis, and he signed an agreement with the United States giving us permission to build bases on Greenland. He committed treason against a puppet government to save the free world. He gave us the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the North Atlantic. That agreement allowed us to hunt U-boats. It allowed us to ferry aircraft to Britain. It allowed us to win the war in the Atlantic. That is the foundation. That is the bedrock. Then came the Cold War. As the Iron Curtain fell, the geography of the world changed. The threat wasn't coming from the east anymore, it was coming from the north, over the pole. If the Soviet Union was going to strike the United States, they weren't going to fly across the Atlantic, they were going to fly over the Arctic ice cap. So we went back to the Danes. We went back to Greenland. And we built Thule Air Base. It is the northernmost installation of the U.S. Armed Forces. It is a marvel of engineering, built on the permafrost. But more importantly, it is the home of the 12th Space Warning Squadron. It is the home of the massive, phased array radar that acts as the eyes of the American nuclear shield. For 70 years, the deal has been simple. Denmark allows us to occupy this critical sovereign soil. They allow us to trample on their environmental regulations. They allow us to store nuclear material. They allow us to operate a massive military footprint in their backyard. And in exchange? In exchange, we treat them with dignity. We treat them as a partner. We guarantee their security with the full might of the American military. It was a good deal. It was a fair deal. It was a deal based on mutual survival. But for the last several years, Washington has treated this relationship not as a strategic partnership, but as a burden. We have seen the administration ridicule the Danish Prime Minister. We have seen the sudden bizarre attempt to buy Greenland in 2019, which was treated as a joke by the media, but was treated as a grave insult by Copenhagen. They told us then, "We are not for sale." Washington didn't listen. The arrogance of the current administration led them to believe that Denmark had no choice, that they were small and we were big, and therefore they would take whatever abuse we decided to dish out. We assumed that because they are polite, they are weak. We assumed that because they are a small nation of barely 6 million people, they would never dare to stand up to the American Goliath. We forgot the lesson of Henrik Kaufmann. We forgot that the Danes have a history of quiet, stubborn, immovable resistance when they are pushed too far. We forgot that you cannot buy honor. And today, that amnesia has caught up with us. Let's get into the weeds here. I want you to understand exactly what is at stake, because the administration is banking on the fact that you won't understand it. They are banking on the idea that Greenland sounds like a faraway, icy abstraction that doesn't affect your daily life. They are wrong. This is about the physics of detection. This is about the curvature of the Earth and the speed of a ballistic missile. The centerpiece of this crisis is the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMEWS, specifically the AN/FPS-132 upgraded early warning radar at Thule. This isn't just a spinning dish like you see in old movies. This is a massive, solid-state, phased array structure. It doesn't spin, it stares. It stares electronically, continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, deep into the airspace of Russia and over the Arctic Circle. Here is the mechanics of the problem. The Earth is round. Radar travels in a straight line. If you put a radar in Kansas, it cannot see a missile launching from Siberia until that missile is already high in the sky, well on its way to its target. By the time a radar in the continental US sees the threat, you have minutes, maybe seconds, to respond. Thule changes the geometry. Because it sits at the top of the world, it peers over the curve of the Earth. It sees the launch almost immediately. It provides the crucial mid-course tracking data. It calculates the trajectory. It tells NORAD in Colorado Springs exactly where that object is going, how fast it is moving, and whether it is a decoy or a warhead. Without Thule, the United States is effectively blind in the northern sector. We have other radars in Fylingdales, UK, and Clear, Alaska, but Thule is the keystone. If you take Thule offline, you create a gap, a blind spot, a corridor of vulnerability that every adversary on the planet can see on a map. Now, consider the legal mechanism. This base operates under the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement. It is a bilateral treaty. It is not a rental agreement we can just renew with cash. It requires the consent of the Danish government and, increasingly, the Greenlandic government, Naalakkersuisut. What Trump has done, according to these reports, is threaten to slap punitive tariffs on the entire Danish economy, hitting their shipping giant Maersk, hitting their pharmaceutical industry, hitting their agricultural exports, unless they grant the U.S. exclusive, perpetual sovereignty over the land beneath the base and potentially expand it for new hypersonic missile testing. He is trying to use a trade war to seize territory. He is trying to use the tactics of a 1980s real estate developer, squeezing a tenant to force a sale on a sovereign NATO ally. But here is where the mechanism breaks down. Denmark is a member of the European Union. Denmark is a member of NATO. You cannot sanction Denmark without declaring economic war on the entire European bloc. And you cannot threaten to abandon Denmark militarily without effectively dissolving Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all. But the unwritten corollary is that the defense of one is the defense of all. If the U.S. says we will not defend Denmark because they won't sell us their land, then Article 5 is a dead letter. It means the security guarantee is transactional. It means it's a protection racket. Nice country you have there, shame if something happened to it. And the moment you turn NATO into a protection racket, the alliance is over. The mechanism of deterrence relies on certainty. It relies on the enemy knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, that if they cross the line, the response will be total. Trump has introduced doubt. He has introduced a conditionality to our defense. He has told the world that American protection is available only to the highest bidder or the most compliant sycophant. Furthermore, let's look at the gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. This is the naval choke point of the Atlantic. Russian submarines, the quiet nuclear-armed hunter-killers, have to pass through this gap to get into the Atlantic Ocean to threaten the American East Coast. We monitor that gap with underwater sound surveillance systems, SOSUS, and maritime patrol aircraft that fly out of, you guessed it, Greenland and Iceland. If Denmark restricts U.S. access to Greenlandic airspace or ports in retaliation, which they have the sovereign right to do, we lose the ability to track those submarines. We lose the ability to close the gate. We are voluntarily smashing the lock on our own front door because we got into an argument with the locksmith. It is a failure of mechanics. It is a failure of logic. It is the deliberate sabotage of the machinery of American safety. But here is the twist. Here is the moment where the underdog, the quiet neighbor, the country we underestimated, played a card that Washington didn't even know was in the deck. While the White House was blustering, while the president was reportedly drafting tweets about disloyal Danes, Copenhagen was busy doing something else. They were writing a new contract. Sources in Brussels and Copenhagen are confirming tonight that Denmark has quietly initiated what they are calling the Arctic Sovereignty Protocol. It's a boring name for a revolutionary maneuver. Denmark has realized that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. They looked at the erratic behavior, the threats, the instability, and they made a calculation. They decided they needed an insurance policy. So what did they do? They didn't just threaten to kick us out. That would be suicidal. Instead, they opened the door to someone else. Not Russia, not China. They opened the door to the European Union. For decades, Denmark has had a special opt out from EU defense cooperation. They kept their military integrated with NATO and the US and separate from the growing EU defense structures. It was a favor to us. It kept Washington as the primary partner. But in a stunning reversal, Danish officials have reportedly signaled they are triggering an emergency integration of Greenland's security architecture into the European Common Security and Defense Policy. They are inviting French and German surveillance assets to share the burden in the Arctic. They are proposing a European Arctic Command to be based in Greenland. Do you understand the brilliance of this trap? If Trump sanctions Denmark, he is attacking a joint European defense project. If he pulls U.S. troops, he isn't leaving a vacuum for Russia to fill. He is leaving a vacuum that our European allies will fill. He is forcing Europe to create its own army, its own independence, its own brain. He tried to isolate Denmark to bully them. Instead, Denmark instantly welded itself to the entirety of the European continent. They made the issue of Greenland a European issue, not just a Danish one. The White House is reportedly in shock. They expected Denmark to come crawling back, begging for the tariffs to be lifted. They expected the Prime Minister to fly to Washington and apologize. Instead, she flew to Brussels. She flew to Paris. She solidified an alliance that excludes the United States from the decision-making table in the Arctic. It is a masterstroke of diplomatic judo. They use Trump's own aggression to justify the one thing Washington has feared for decades: a Europe that doesn't need America to defend itself, a Europe that is capable of saying no. The trap has snapped shut, and the United States is not the hunter anymore. We are the ones caught in the mechanism. We threatened to leave, and they said, okay, here's your coat. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. This is the turning point. This is the moment where the Atlantic Alliance shifts from a US-led monarchy to a partnership of equals, or perhaps a divorce. Washington thought it was holding a gun to Denmark's head. It turns out Denmark was holding the keys to the only gate that matters, and they just changed the locks. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, okay, Rachel, this is fascinating geopolitical chess, but I live in Ohio. I live in Florida. I live in Oregon. Why does a radar station in Greenland or a diplomatic spat in Copenhagen matter to me? Why should I care about the Arctic Sovereignty Protocol? You should care because this isn't just about generals and maps. This is about the very real, very frightening fragility of the life you are living right now. Let's talk about the farmers in the Midwest. Let's talk about the soy and corn growers who have already been battered by trade wars for the last 4 years. Maersk, the Danish shipping giant, controls roughly 1/5 of the entire world's shipping fleet. They move the goods. They move the grain, they move the tractors. If the U.S. government enters a full-blown diplomatic and economic war with Denmark, and by extension the EU, the friction in global shipping doesn't just slow things down. It stops them. It means the cost of fertilizer goes up. It means the cost of getting your harvest to market goes up. It means that markets in Europe that used to buy American produce suddenly close their doors, not because they don't want the corn, but because they cannot trust the political risk of doing business with an erratic America. Let's talk about the workers in the defense industry. There are thousands of Americans, engineers, contractors, logistics experts, whose jobs are tied directly to the maintenance and operation of these northern warning systems. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, the small subcontractors in Colorado and Alabama. If that architecture is dismantled, if those contracts are voided because we got kicked out of the country, those pink slips go out on Friday. That is real income, real mortgages, real tuition payments evaporating because of a temper tantrum in the Oval Office. But go deeper. Think about the feeling of safety you have when you go to sleep at night. You probably don't think about nuclear deterrence. You don't think about the Russian Northern Fleet. You don't think about it because you haven't had to. You haven't had to because the system worked, because the wall was high and the watchmen were awake. This is the ultimate betrayal of the regular American family. The primary job of the president, the only job that really matters in the end, is to keep the wolf from the door, to ensure that the physical safety of the citizenry is guaranteed. By playing roulette with the Arctic radar shield, by alienating the allies who hold the flashlight in the dark, the administration is gambling with your safety. They are creating a world where the warning time for a catastrophic event is cut in half, where the certainty of peace is replaced by the ambiguity of chaos. And who pays the price for that ambiguity? It's not the politicians. They have bunkers, they have private security, they have assets overseas. The price is paid by the military families who have to deploy into hostile zones without the support of allies. It is paid by the National Guard members who get called up when the systems fail. It is paid by every single person who relies on the stability of the global economy to keep their 401k from crashing, to keep gas prices stable, to keep the grocery store shelves stocked. When the supply chains break because of a diplomatic ego trip, you see it at the checkout counter. When the alliances break, you see it in the eyes of your children when they ask why the news is so scary. This destroys the predictability of American life. It introduces a level of volatility that we are not equipped to handle. We are already dealing with a pandemic recovery, with inflation, with social division. The last thing, the absolute last thing the working families of this country need is a self-inflicted wound that shatters the Western alliance and tanks the transatlantic economy. But that is exactly what has been delivered to your doorstep. A crisis manufactured out of thin air, fueled by arrogance, and paid for with your peace of mind. It is a theft. They have stolen the stability that you paid for with your taxes and your votes. They have taken the quiet night and turned it into a blaring siren. And they did it for nothing. They did it for a headline. They did it for a soundbite. That is the human cost. It is the loss of the luxury of not being afraid. Behind the scenes, the facade of confidence is crumbling. If you could see the text messages flying between Capitol Hill and the K Street lobbying firms tonight, you would see pure, unadulterated panic. Because the Republicans in the Senate, the ones who usually line up to defend the president no matter what, they know what this means. They have donors. They have defense contractors in their districts. They have agricultural giants who are screaming into their phones right now, demanding to know why the president is picking a fight with the literal gatekeepers of the Atlantic trade routes. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over Washington when things go truly, irrevocably wrong. It's not the noise of the spin room. It's the silence of the realizing. It's the silence of senators who are suddenly unavailable for comment. It's the silence of the State Department officials who are leaking like sieves because they are terrified that they will be blamed for this disaster. We are hearing reports of shouting matches in the West Wing. Advisors who tried to warn the president that Denmark wasn't a business competitor to be crushed, but a sovereign nation with dignity, are now being sidelined. The adults in the room are gone, and the ones left are looking at the maps, looking at the angry statements from the EU, looking at the defiant posture of the Danish Prime Minister, and they are realizing they have no exit strategy. They thought they could bluff. They thought Denmark would fold. Denmark called the bluff. And now the administration is holding a hand of nothing but mismatched cards, while the rest of the world watches. The Pentagon is reportedly drafting emergency contingencies for a loss of access scenario in the Arctic. Do you know how insane that sounds? That the US military has to plan for losing access to its own strategic assets, not because of enemy action, not because of a war, but because our own commander-in-chief insulted the landlord? This is political malpractice on a scale that is hard to comprehend. And the panic you are sensing from Washington tonight is the realization that this bell cannot be unrung. You cannot insult a nation's sovereignty, threaten their economy, and jeopardize their security, and then expect them to shake hands and forget it next week. The trust is broken. The lobbyists know it, the generals know it, and deep down, in the quiet corners of the cloakroom, even the president's staunchest defenders know it. They have ridden the tiger for 4 years, and tonight the tiger turned around and bit them. So where does this leave us? It leaves us alone. It leaves us standing on the other side of the Atlantic, watching the lights go out in Europe, not because they ran out of power, but because they turned them off to us. We are witnessing the end of an era, the era where the United States was the indispensable nation, the era where we were the mortar that held the world together. We have chipped away at that mortar until the dust is choking us. Denmark didn't just flip out, Denmark woke up. They woke up to the reality that the United States under this leadership is a risk, not an asset, and the rest of the world is waking up with them. The warning for tonight is simple. You cannot abuse your friends forever. You cannot treat loyalty as a weakness. You cannot govern the world with the emotional maturity of a toddler and the aggressive tactics of a mob boss. Eventually, the townspeople stop paying the protection money. Eventually, the neighbors build their own fences. We are watching the contraction of American power. Not caused by China, not caused by Russia, but caused by us, by our own hubris, by our own refusal to understand the basic physics of human relationships. The integrity of the bond has failed. The structure is compromised. And as we look north, toward the ice, toward the dark, we have to ask ourselves a terrifying question. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, when the radar blips, when the red phone rings, who is going to answer on the other end? Will it be a friend, or will it be a dial tone? Tonight, thanks to the incandescent stupidity of this administration, I fear we know the answer. Watch this space.